The air inside the restaurant was cool and smelled faintly of expensive coffee and vanilla. It was that kind of place where the lights are hung low, not to save electricity, but to make the people inside look better. The tables were covered in white cloths that hung down low, hiding the knees of the customers. It was a Tuesday night, which meant the crowd was smaller than usual. But the money sitting at the tables was just as green dot in the center of the room. Sitting alone and looking a bit lonely was a grand piano. It was a beautiful thing, black and shiny. You could see your reflection in the side of it if you leaned in close. But for the last hour, nobody had touched it. It just sat there like a piece of furniture. Waiting for someone who wasn't going to show up, Julie moved through the room with a white towel folded over her arm. She was a young woman, maybe in her middle 20s, though her eyes looked a little older. Working in a place like this taught you how to walk without making a sound and how to smile even when your feet hurt. She was carrying a tray with 2 glasses of sparkling water. The bubbles rose to the top and popped, one by one. She walked toward the back corner, where a man sat by himself. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than Julie's car. His tie was loose, and he was tapping a silver pen against the table. He looked like a man who was used to getting what he wanted, usually very fast. Julie set the water down on the table. "Here is your water, sir," she said softly. The man looked up. He had sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He looked at Julie, then past her, toward the big piano in the middle of the room. "I didn't order water," the man said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the soft music playing in the background. "It is from the bar, sir." "Compliments of the house," Julie lied smoothly. It wasn't true, but it was what her manager told her to say. "To the big spenders to keep them happy." The man let out a short laugh through his nose. "Compliments, right?" He took a sip, set the glass down, and didn't look at Julie. He looked at the piano again. Julie shifted her weight. She wanted to go back to the kitchen, away from this heavy silence. But the man seemed to be in a talking mood. "That thing is a waste of space," the man said, pointing his pen at the instrument. "Nobody plays it. It's just for show. Like a plastic plant." Julie glanced over at it. She had been trying not to look at it all night. Every time she walked past it, her fingers would twitch. It was a strange feeling, like a ghost reaching out from inside her chest. "It is a nice piano," Julie said carefully. "It just needs the right player." "Is that so?" The man turned his focus fully on her now. He swirled the ice in his glass. "You seem to know a lot about it. Do you play?" Julie felt a sudden tightness in her throat. She gripped the tray tighter. "I used to. A long time ago." "Used to," the man repeated, drawing the words out like he was tasting them. That is a phrase people use when they have given up on something. "I stopped running. I stopped painting. I stopped playing." "Used to" means you quit. Julie didn't like where this was going. She had tables to clear. She had bills to pay at home. "It is just a phrase, sir. Can I get you anything else?" The man ignored the question. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms out along the top of the booth. He looked like a king on a throne. He was bored. You could see it in his face. He had enough money to buy anything he wanted, and now he was just looking for something to do to pass the time. "I am feeling generous tonight," the man said. "I like bets. I like challenges. I see you looking at that piano every time you walk by. You look at it like you miss it." Julie stood very still. She didn't want to have this conversation, especially not here, not with a stranger. "I am just a waitress, sir. That is just a uniform," the man said, waving his hand at her apron. "It is not who you are. I will make you a deal. A simple bet." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick roll of cash held together by a gold clip. He didn't count it, but Julie could see it was a lot of money. It was enough to pay rent for 2 months. It was enough to fix the heater in her apartment that had been broken all winter. "If you walk over there," he pointed the pen again, "and play one song. Just one. And if you play it well, better than the noise they play on the speakers, this cash is yours. A tip. Right now." Julie looked at the money. Her heart beat faster. Not because she wanted to show off, but because she needed that help. Life had been hard lately. Everything felt heavy, like walking through deep mud. "And if I can't?" Julie asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Then you admit you are just pretending," the man said. He smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who thought they already knew the answer. "You admit that you are just a waitress who likes to look at expensive things she can't have. And you refill my water glass?" Few people at the tables nearby had stopped eating. They were listening. The room felt smaller suddenly. The air felt thick. Julie looked at the money, then at the man's face. He expected her to fail. He wanted her to fail so he could feel superior. It was a game to him. But to Julie, it wasn't a game. The money was real. The need was real. But the fear was real too. She looked over at the piano. The black wood looked dark and deep. "Don't play," a voice in her head warned her. Asterisk, "It hurts too much. It will remind you of everything you lost." Asterisk, but she remembered the cold wind coming through the cracks in her apartment windows. She remembered the stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen counter. "Okay," Julie said. "One song." The man sat up straighter, looking pleased. He took the money and set it on the edge of the table, right next to his water glass. "Excellent. Let's see what you have." Julie turned around. The walk to the piano felt longer than it really was. With every step, her legs felt heavier. She could feel everyone's eyes on her back. They were judging her. They were waiting for the show. She reached the piano. The bench was black leather. It looked cold. She stood there for a moment, just looking at the keys. They were white and black, waiting. They looked the same as they did 6 years ago, before the world turned upside down. Before the funeral, she slowly sat down. The leather creaked softly under her weight. She was close enough to smell the polish. She hovered her hands over the keys. Her fingers were shaking, just a little bit. From his table, the man in the expensive suit watched. He swirled his drink, ready to laugh, ready to teach a lesson about knowing your place in the world. He thought he knew exactly what was going to happen next. He was wrong. The distance between her table and the piano had felt long, but sitting there on the bench felt like being on a different planet. The leather was cold against her legs. In front of her, the 88 black and white keys waited. They weren't moving. They were just staring back at her, silent and judging. It was so quiet in the restaurant that she could hear the ice melting in the glasses across the room. She placed her hands on her knees, for a moment to wipe the sweat off her palms. Her heart was beating so hard that she could feel it thumping against her ribs. It wasn't the fear of the man in the suit. It wasn't really the fear of the money. It was the fear of the sound. The music held memories that she had spent 6 years trying to run away from. From the corner of the room, the man in the suit was watching her closely. He had finished his drink and was now just playing with the empty glass. He looked like a cat watching a mouse. He thought he had one already. He thought she would freeze up or play a silly little song, something a child would learn in their first week of lessons. He was waiting for her to fail so he could feel Big Dot. Julie took a deep breath. The air smelled like roasted garlic and expensive perfume, but for a second, she smelled something else. She smelled old paper and dust. She smelled the inside of her mother's small house. The memory hit her hard, sudden, and sharp. It wasn't a gentle picture. It was a flash of a hospital room, the color white everywhere, and the beep-beep-beep of a machine that was keeping someone alive. She remembered sitting by a bed, holding a hand that was getting colder every day. Her mother had been the one who taught her the piano. Not in a fancy school, but on an old, beat-up piano they found at a garage sale for $50. Asterisk, don't stop playing. Julie, asterisk, her mother had whispered, her voice sounding like dry leaves. Asterisk, the music is the only thing that keeps the soul alive. When you can't speak anymore, you play. When the words get stuck in your throat, you let the keys say it for you. Asterisk, that was the last thing her mother ever said to her. 2 days later, the bed was empty. After the funeral, life got loud. The bills came. The landlord knocked on the door. The silence in the apartment was too heavy to bear, so Julie did the one thing she promised she would never do. She sold her piano. She let two strangers carry it out the front door on a rainy afternoon. She watched the taillights of their truck fade away, and she felt like she was selling her own soul. She vowed never to touch the keys again because the pain was just too much. It was like touching a hot stove. But now she was sitting here. The money was on the table. The rent was due. She had to do this. She lifted her hands off her knees. They were shaking. She hovered them over the keys, just a few inches away. The black keys stood up like little jagged mountains. The white keys were the valleys. She tried to remember where to put her fingers. It had been so long. The man in the suit checked his watch. He let out a loud sigh, just to make sure everyone heard him. He was trying to rush her. He wanted her to get nervous. Julie squeezed her eyes shut. She blocked out the man. She blocked out the people eating their steaks. She blocked out the fancy lights. She thought about the melody in her head. It was a song she had never written down on paper. It was a song that had been playing in her head while she walked to the bus stop, while she scrubbed floors, and while she counted pennies at the grocery store. It was a song made of tiredness and hope mixed together. She opened her eyes. She wasn't looking at the people anymore. She was looking at the ivory. She pressed down a key. It was a low C note. The sound was deep and rich, vibrating through the floor and up the legs of the bench. It wasn't a screech. It was clear. Then she pressed another note. Then a third. She wasn't playing a famous song. She wasn't playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. She was playing that melody in her head. Her left hand found a rhythm, a slow, steady heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. Her right hand began to move across the higher notes. Weaving a pattern that sounded like a story at first, her fingers were stiff. They felt like rusty hinges on a gate that hadn't been opened in years. But as the notes started to connect, something clicked. The stiffness went away. It was like riding a bicycle. Her muscles remembered what her brain had tried to forget. The song was sad. There was no hiding it. It was a slow, crying melody. It sounded like someone saying goodbye. But underneath the sadness, there was a thread of something strong. It sounded like survival. The noise in the restaurant changed. The clinking of forks stopped. The low murmur of voices faded away until there was almost total silence. The piano was the only thing speaking. Julie forgot about the bet. She forgot about the $10,000 on the table. She forgot about the man in the suit. She was lost in the music. Every time she pressed a key, she felt a little bit of the weight on her shoulders lift up. It was scary, but it felt good. It was like bleeding out a poison that had been inside her for years. She played a run of notes that went higher and higher, climbing up the scale. The sound filled the high ceiling of the restaurant. It bounced off the mirrors and the glass windows. It was a sound that demanded to be heard. The man in the suit stopped tapping his pen. His smile had slipped off his face. He was sitting forward now, his elbows on the table. He looked confused. He looked at the piano, then at the back of the young woman sitting there. He hadn't expected this. He had expected a joke. He had expected to laugh. But this was not a joke. Julie hit a chord that hung in the air, vibrating. It was a beautiful, painful sound. She held it, letting it ring out until the sound turned into a whisper. Then her hands moved to the next part of the song. It was a little faster now, more urgent. Her fingers were flying over the keys, finding the spots without even looking. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. In this moment, with the sound washing over her, she was an artist again. She was the little girl sitting on the piano bench next to her mother. She was the girl who had dreams bigger than this city. She felt tears stinging the corners of her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The music had taken control. The first few chords had been shaky, but now the music was flowing like a river that had just broken through a dam. Julie's fingers, which had felt stiff and cold just moments ago, were beginning to warm up. They moved across the keys with a speed that surprised even her. It was as if her hands had a mind of their own, remembering the thousands of hours of practice, and she had done as a teenager. She wasn't playing a song that anyone would hear on the radio. It wasn't pop music, and it wasn't classical music that you would hear in a concert hall. It was something raw and real. It was a mix of sadness and hope, all tangled together. The melody climbed up high, sounding like a bird trying to fly out of a cage, and then it would crash down low. Sounding like the weight of the world dragging it back to the ground in the restaurant, the silence was getting deeper. It wasn't just that people stopped talking. It was that they stopped eating. Forks were hovering halfway to mouths. Glasses of wine sat on the table, ignored. People stopped caring about their expensive dinners and their business deals. They were all staring at the young woman in the waitress uniform. A young couple near the window stopped holding hands and turned their chairs toward the piano. The man stopped checking his phone. Even the chefs in the kitchen had poked their heads out through the serving pass, wiping their hands on their aprons. Listening to the sound that was drifting through the room, the music was filling up every empty space in the room. It bounced off the ceiling and wrapped around the tables. It felt like the air in the room had changed. It felt heavier, but in a good way. It felt like everyone was holding their breath. Julie had her eyes closed tight. She was not seeing the restaurant anymore. She was seeing a different place. She was seeing a small, dusty living room with sunlight streaming in through yellow curtains. She felt the presence of her mother sitting next to her on the bench, smelling like lavender soap. She could almost hear the gentle voice guiding her hands, telling her which fingers to use for the hard parts. It was a strange feeling. It hurt to remember it, but it also felt good to let it out. For 6 years, she had kept a lid on her feelings. She had focused on work, on paying bills, on surviving. She had locked the music away in a box in her mind and thrown away the key. But now, the box was open. Everything was pouring out through her fingers. She hit a series of notes that were fast and sharp, like rain tapping on a tin roof, even though there was no rain outside. The rhythm was strong. It sounded like a heartbeat. It was the sound of life. It was the sound of someone fighting to keep going, even when things are hard. The man in the suit sat very still in his corner booth. The smirk was completely gone from his face. His glass of water sat on the table, untouched. He was watching Julie's hands. They were moving so fast, they were almost a blur. He had expected her to be nervous. He had expected her to make a mistake, to hit a wrong note, or to give up halfway through. That is what he wanted. He wanted to prove that money was the only thing that mattered. He wanted to prove that a waitress could never understand the art that he pretended to appreciate, but he was wrong. He was listening to a sound that he hadn't heard in a very long time. He was hearing honesty. The man looked around the room. He saw the other customers. He saw the way they were looking at the piano, not at Julie, but into the music. He realized that nobody cared about his expensive suit right now. Nobody cared that he was a millionaire. In the face of this melody, his money meant nothing. He couldn't buy this feeling. He couldn't write a check to make someone play with this kind of passion. He suddenly felt very small. He felt like a fake. The music changed again. The loud, crashing notes softened into something gentle. It was like the storm was passing and the sun was coming out. The melody became sweet and simple. It was the sound of forgiveness. It was the sound of letting go. Julie's shoulders, which had been hunched up tight by her neck, finally started to drop. She was breathing easier. The tension that she carried in her back every single day was melting away. She wasn't performing for a crowd anymore. She was alone with the music. She was telling the piano a story that she could never say out loud. She was telling it about the long nights, the cold winters, the loneliness, and the tiny spark of hope that she still kept hidden deep inside. She played a phrase that repeated itself, getting a little softer each time. It was like an echo fading away in a valley. The silence in the room was absolute now. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator behind the bar, but that was it. No one dared to cough. No one dared to shift in their chair. It felt like the music was a spell, and as long as Julie was playing, nobody could move. She played the final notes of the verse. It ended on a low note that rang out deep and full, vibrating through the floorboards. She let her hands rest on the keys, letting the sound hang in the air until it faded into nothing. For a long second, nobody moved. The man in the suit forgot to blink. The air in the room felt charged, like electricity just before a storm hits. Then, Julie took a deep breath and moved her hands to start the next part. She wasn't finished yet. The song had more to say. She had shown them the sadness, but now she had to show them the strength. Her fingers found the keys again, starting a rhythm that was stronger, more confident. This wasn't just a memory anymore. This was happening right now. She was here. She was good. And she was proving to everyone, and mostly to herself, that she hadn't lost it. The music was still there. It had been waiting for her to come back. The music shifted again, moving from the gentle, sad rhythm into something much stronger. It was like watching a gray sky suddenly break open with light. The notes were getting faster, climbing higher and higher up the scale. It wasn't just a pretty sound anymore. It was powerful. It felt like a wave building up in the ocean, getting ready to crash. Julie was fully lost in it now. Her eyes were still closed, but her head was tilted back slightly. A small smile was touching her lips, but it was a sad smile, the kind you have when you remember something wonderful that you can never get back. Her hands were dancing over the keys. The fingers of her right hand were playing a melody that was fast and bright, while her left hand was keeping a steady, heavy beat. Like a heart that refused to stop beating, the sound filled every corner of the room. It wasn't just noise. It was a story. It was the story of the last 6 years of her life. The hard parts were in the low notes, the moments where the music sounded dark and heavy. The moments of hope were in the high notes, the trills that sounded like birds singing. It was a fight. She was fighting the music, fighting the memories, and fighting the idea that she was just a waitress. This wasn't good enough. The man in the expensive suit sat frozen in his chair. He hadn't taken a sip of his drink in a long time. The ice in his glass had completely melted, leaving only a watery residue. He wasn't looking at his phone anymore. He wasn't looking at the other people to see if they were impressed by him. He was staring at Julie. A strange feeling was growing in his chest. It felt tight. It felt uncomfortable. He watched her hands moving with such speed and grace. He thought about his own life. He thought about his big office on the top floor of a glass building. He thought about the meetings where people shouted at each other over numbers on a screen. He thought about the suits he bought that were tailored perfectly to fit his body, and the watch on his wrist that cost more than most people made in a year. He had everything. He had more money than he could ever spend. But as he listened to the music, he realized he had nothing that sounded like this. His life was quiet in the wrong way. It was empty. He filled his days with noise, traffic, airplanes, ringing phones, but he didn't have this. He didn't have this passion. He didn't have this kind of fire burning inside him. He had traded his own passions for safety and for status a long time ago. Suddenly, a memory from his own childhood popped into his head. He remembered being a little boy, sitting on the floor of his parents' living room. He remembered having a set of colored pencils and a thick pad of paper. He remembered drawing for hours, not caring about what time it was or what he was supposed to be doing. He remembered the feeling of the wax on the paper, the smell of the wood, and the joy of creating something that was only his. But then he remembered growing up. He remembered his father telling him that artists don't make money. He remembered throwing the pencils in the trash because he wanted to be a serious man. He remembered making the choice to stop creating and start calculating. Hearing Julie play made him realize that he had made the wrong choice. He was rich, yes. He could buy anything he wanted, but he couldn't buy what Julie had. She was poor in terms of money, but in this moment, she was richer than he would ever be. She had a soul that could sing. He felt a sharp pang of jealousy. It was a bitter taste in his mouth. The music reached its highest point yet. The sound was soaring, lifting the ceiling off the room. It was loud, but it wasn't painful. It was a majestic sound. It sounded like victory. A single tear escaped from Julie's closed eye and rolled down her cheek. It caught the light from the chandelier above, shining like a diamond for a second before falling onto her black apron. She didn't wipe it away. She didn't seem to notice it. She was pouring everything she had left into the instrument. She was emptying herself out. Note by note, the man in the suit watched that tear fall. He felt a lump form in his own throat. He swallowed hard, trying to push it down. He didn't want to feel this. He didn't want to be moved. He wanted to be the one in control, the one who judged, But he wasn't the judge anymore. He was the student, and she was the teacher. He looked at the money he had placed on the table edge. The stack of bills looked ridiculous now. It looked insulting. How could he possibly put a price tag on this? How could he think that $10,000 was equal to the sound she was making? It was absurd. It was arrogant. It made him feel small and petty around the room. People were starting to realize the song was coming to an end. The energy in the room shifted. They knew they were witnessing something special, something that doesn't happen very often in life. They were witnessing a moment of pure, unfiltered truth. Julie's hands slowed down. The frantic, fast notes smoothed out. She brought the melody back down to the middle of the piano. The music became soft again, like the quiet after a storm. She was gently bringing the song to a close, resolving the tension that had built up over the last few minutes. She played a final sequence of chords, resolving the song into a deep, peaceful harmony. She held her hands down on the keys, letting the sound vibrate through the wood and fill the room one last time. The silence that followed was the heaviest silence the restaurant had ever known. Nobody spoke. Nobody clapped. It didn't feel right to clap. Clapping would break the spell. It would make it feel like a performance, like a show you watch on TV. This was too personal. This was too real. The man in the suit sat back, the breath knocked out of him. He looked at his hands. They were empty. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful. He didn't feel like the king of the world. He just felt like a man who had wasted a lot of time chasing the wrong things. He realized that he had been asleep for a long time. Julie had just woken him up. He watched as Julie lifted her hands off the keys. The spell was broken. Her shoulders slumped forward, and the reality of where she was came rushing back to her. She opened her eyes, looking dazed, as if she had just woken up from a vivid dream. The last note faded away into the air, disappearing like smoke. The silence that followed was heavy and thick. It wasn't an awkward silence, but a respectful one. It was the kind of quiet that happens when something truly important has just been said, and everyone needs a moment to understand it. Julie sat on the bench, her hands resting lightly in her lap. The rush of the music was leaving her body, replaced by a sudden cold wave of reality. She opened her eyes and blinked a few times. The bright lights of the restaurant seemed harsh compared to the dark place she had gone to in her mind. She looked around and saw the faces staring at her. For a second, she felt proud. But then, panic set in. She realized what she had done. She had poured out her soul in a public place. She had shown strangers her pain and her dreams. It felt too vulnerable. It felt like walking outside without clothes on. Her cheeks turned red with embarrassment. She quickly stood up, scraping the bench leg against the floor. The sound was loud and scratched the quiet air. She couldn't look at the people. She couldn't look at the table where the man in the suit was sitting. She just wanted to hide. She wanted to run back to the kitchen, grab her bag, and go home. She felt foolish for thinking she could do this. For thinking she deserved to be up there, she turned toward the swinging door that led to the staff area. Walking fast. "Wait," a voice said. It wasn't loud, but it stopped her. It cut through the haze of her embarrassment. She froze near the table where the couple was sitting. She didn't want to turn around, but she had to. The man in the suit was standing up. He didn't look arrogant anymore. He didn't look like he was playing a game. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or maybe like a man who had just found something he'd lost a long time ago. He picked up the thick stack of money from the table. He walked over to her, moving slower than before. He reached her side and gently blocked her path to the kitchen. "You played beautifully," he said. His voice was quiet. It wasn't the commanding voice he used earlier when he ordered water. It was soft, almost shaky. "Thank you," Julie whispered. She couldn't look him in the eye. She stared at the tie clip on his chest. "I have to go. I have work to do." "Take the money," he said. He held out the cash. Julie hesitated. She looked at the bills. She remembered the rent. She remembered the broken heater. It was a lot of money. It would solve so many problems. But something felt wrong about taking it now. The music hadn't been a transaction. It had been a release. It was a bet, the man said, reading her mind. A deal is a deal. You played. You were amazing. You deserve this. He pressed the money into her hand. His fingers brushed hers, and she noticed that his hand wasn't steady. He was trembling just a little bit. But I need to say something else, he continued. He took a deep breath, like he was preparing to jump into a pool of cold water. I was wrong. Not about the bet, but about you, and about myself. Julie looked up at him, surprised. She saw his eyes. They looked sad. I thought I was testing you, the man said, looking away toward the empty piano. I thought I was just having some fun. I thought I was better than you because I have money in the bank. But listening to you, it made me realize how empty I am. He laughed a short, dry laugh. I haven't felt anything real in a long time. I go to meetings. I sign papers. I buy expensive things. But none of it makes me feel the way that song just did. You have a gift, Julie. A gift I can never buy. Lee stood there holding the money, stunned. She didn't know what to say. She expected him to brag, or to tell her she should quit her job. She didn't expect him to open up his own heart. I used to love drawing, the man said softly. When I was a boy, that was all I wanted to do. But I let it go. I thought it wasn't practical. I thought being rich was more important. Hearing you play tonight made me miss that part of me. It made me realize I sold out a long time ago. He looked back at her. So, please, take the money. You need it. I know that. Life is hard. But don't you ever stop playing again. Not for me, not for anyone. The world is too loud. We need people who can make it quiet with music. Julie felt a tear slide down her cheek, different from the one she shed while playing. This one wasn't from sadness. It was from gratitude. She realized that in trying to save herself from embarrassment, she had actually helped this man find a piece of himself he lost. I won't stop, she said softly. I promise. The man nodded. He didn't smile, but his face relaxed. He looked peaceful. Good. Good luck, Julie. He didn't go back to his table. He didn't finish his drink. He didn't ask for the check. He just walked away. He walked through the maze of tables, past the people who were still watching him. He walked straight to the front of the restaurant. He pushed the glass door open and stepped out into the cool night air. The streetlights were flickering. A car drove past. He took a deep breath of the fresh air. He felt lighter. He felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He didn't go to his car immediately. He stood there on the sidewalk for a long time, looking up at the sky. He thought about the old art supplies gathering dust in his attic. He made a decision in that moment. He was going to go home. He was going to find those pencils. He was going to try to draw again. Inside, Julie was still standing near the piano. The restaurant was slowly coming back to life. People were starting to whisper again. The sounds of forks and plates returned. A manager came out of the kitchen, looking confused. Julie, is everything okay? Julie looked at the money in her hand. It was heavy, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. She looked at the piano. Yes, Julie said. She finally smiled, a real smile. Everything's okay. She took the money and put it safely in her apron pocket. Then she walked over to her next table to take an order. But she walked differently. Her back was straighter. Her step was lighter. She knew she was a waitress, and she knew she had bills to pay. But she also knew she was a musician, and that was something no one could ever take away from her again. The night wasn't over, and the work wasn't done, but the music was inside her now, and it would stay there, warming her from the inside out.